At last, a voice for the silent majority of America, the people who pay big government's bills rather than the ones who make big government's bills. Welcome to the inaugural edition of Speaking of Taxpayers from the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union. I'm your host, Pete Sepp.
And Natasha Altamirano.
As I said, this is the inaugural edition of our great weekly radio program here on Gimme Radio, and I think it's fitting to discuss the inauguration here in Washington, D.C., and the implications that had for taxpayers. Interestingly enough, a lot of pomp and circumstance to inaugurations, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat getting sworn in, but how much pomp can we afford under these economic circumstances? That's the question we are asking today on Speaking of Taxpayers. Just to give you a little background on the costs we're talking about here, the District of Columbia, for example, had $47 million in expenses ranging from security to porta potties. The federal government picks up the tab for that because the District of Columbia is its ward. Surrounding Virginia and Maryland have also asked for money, totaling about $28 million. When you start adding in the federal costs, you're talking about a bill of more than $100 million. Is that something taxpayers ought to be worried about in a time of economic crisis? What do you think, Natasha?
I think it certainly is something that taxpayers need to worry about, especially when you look at what some of these costs are going towards. Obviously, security is always an issue, especially when you're expecting crowds of over 1 million people. But I think some of the costs, such as the thousands of porta potties lining Constitution and Independence Avenues, could have been cut back a little bit. And I know that officials originally were projecting 4 to 5 million visitors to the district, when really it was only about 1.8 million people.
Yes, and of course we're having to consider another cost that hasn't even entered into the equation yet, and that's the cost of declaring Inauguration Day a federal holiday. There are some folks out there who would say that taxpayers have lost a full day's work from the federal government because of that day off. And when you take a look at the federal payroll and the fact that there are still essential personnel that have to be paid no matter who's getting sworn in, no matter what holiday it is, you're talking about a possible cost of $400 million just for that component. That's a pretty steep cost, and, well, you have to wonder, is it better to keep those federal employees at home? I imagine people who've had problems with the IRS or other federal agencies would say, hey, maybe it's a bargain giving these folks a holiday. Maybe we should give them a longer vacation.
I think that's a good point to bring up, Pete. Do you think a lot of taxpayers are aware of these costs, or the general public? I mean, does this issue receive a lot of attention in the media?
No, I don't think it does. It's pretty much one of those things that comes up, well, every 4 years. And this is easily the most expensive inauguration in the history of the presidency. The inauguration for President Bush's second term wasn't even half this cost, actually more like a quarter of this cost when you start adding things up. Granted, it's an historical event, but then we are living in times where people are becoming unemployed, where people are having trouble making ends meet, where they're losing their homes. Maybe this is a time where a little more modesty in expenses is called for. And of course, in past history, there have been questions of the use of official resources for political purposes. For example, Air Force One, where presidents, both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, used Air Force One between campaign stops to raise money, to raise votes as well. And they do that by saying, well, in between these two campaign trips, I have a trip in between that's an official function. They're supposed to allow employees of the political campaign onto Air Force One for the price of a first-class ticket and reimburse the federal government that way, but that doesn't come close to covering the price. Yet another way that we basically do have public financing of campaigns in America, only it's for incumbents, not challengers.
Now, we're talking about presidential inaugurations and the costs associated with that to taxpayers as soon as a president assumes office. But those costs don't necessarily end when the president leaves office. Pete, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Natasha. What we're talking about here is one of the most generous retirement compensation systems in the entire United States government. It's probably the most generous one. George W. Bush will draw a presidential pension starting at $196,700 this year. That pension began immediately upon his leaving office on Inauguration Day. And that can really add up for a guy of George W. Bush's age and health. We used some actuarial tables from the life insurance industry. We figured out he'd live to be about 83 and a half years old, based on projections from other folks. The total lifetime payout, if you consider the fact that the pension is adjusted for the pay of cabinet level members every year, would exceed $5.5 million. That's a pretty hefty price tag for a former president in an era where presidents can command six figures just for giving speeches in the private sector.
And that's not even the worst of it. Former President Bill Clinton's lifetime benefit almost reaches $7 million. And we're not even considering costs other than pensions. You have to consider staff, travel, mail, other office expense reimbursements that can be hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, including office leases.
Yes, Bill Clinton was able to run up a tab of nearly $1.2 million when you factor in all of those things, including a telephone bill of $79,000. Now, by comparison, Jimmy Carter ran up a telephone bill of about $10,000, George H.W. Bush $17,000. You have to wonder, who in the world is Bill Clinton calling? And are they 900 numbers or something like that? I hope not.
I guess he has a lot of friends, maybe long distance.
Many FOBs, friends of Bill.
If we look at office lease costs, Bill Clinton also comes in at the highest of all recent former ex-presidents at $516,000 a year. Carter came in lowest at $102,000 a year, and I think that's saying something when $100,000 a year is a low cost.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think these are precisely the kinds of circumstances that members of Congress worried about when the former President's Act, the legislation that set up all these benefits, was passed in 1958. Interestingly, there had been discussion of giving former presidents pensions in the early 1900s. Andrew Carnegie, for example, offered one in 1912. That would have been privately funded, obviously, but since Congress can't seem to shut the lid on giving out public money, they decided to make it some kind of taxpayer-funded program after it was revealed Harry Truman was having trouble paying postage, answering his mail in retirement. But interestingly enough, when this act was being debated in 1958, the members of the House Post Office and Civil Service Committee, that was the committee considering the legislation, they opposed the bill because of its, quote, unprecedented vagueness, unquote, and they warned of its, quote, wide and dangerous loopholes, unquote. I think that their fears have been proven in spades since that thing has been enacted. In fact, the Congress in 1993 attempted to put a 5-year limit on office allowances for presidents, but unfortunately that limit was repealed in 1997, apparently by the lobbying of Jerry Ford, our dear departed ex-president from the 1970s.
Former presidents aren't the only ones that receive hefty pensions. Vice presidents also get annual payouts that could be as high as $132,000 a year for Dick Cheney. Al Gore, his initial pension was almost $95,000 in 2001, and now we've calculated that his pension benefit for 2009 is more than $120,000. For Dick Cheney, if you consider his entire government career, his lifetime benefit could exceed $3.2 million.
Pretty incredible. Nice work if you can get it. And it's important to remember, even though these fellows have had pretty long careers in government service, Al Gore at least is still a relatively young guy. Dick Cheney less so, but for the years they've served in Congress and the executive branch and the like, they've been rewarded pretty handsomely.
But even government officials who didn't serve honorably can get a pension. A lot of former members of Congress who've been convicted of felonies still continue to draw hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in pension benefits. There was an ethics bill in 2007 that supposedly would curtail the benefits given to congressional felons, but it didn't really do much to those already convicted, did it, Pete?
No, when you get to write the rules are usually pretty lax. The ethics bill said that if a lawmaker becomes convicted of a crime after date of enactment of the bill, and the crime itself was committed after date of enactment of the bill, then the lawmaker could be deprived of his or her pension. But the list of crimes is very exclusive. Bribery is one. Acting on behalf of a foreign agent is another, but conspicuously missing from the small list are things like failing to disclose expenses properly, failing to disclose campaign contributions properly, things like mail fraud, things like we would normally consider to be very serious crimes, murder or manslaughter. And that's no laughing matter, because one member of Congress, a guy by the name of Bill Janklow, was actually convicted of manslaughter back in the early 2000s and could have collected a pension had he served long enough in Congress. So that's not an academic question.
And the bill only applied to acts committed while congressmen were in office, correct?
That is correct.
And things committed from 2007 onward.
That's correct.
So who are some of the lawmakers that are still receiving pensions even though they've been convicted?
Well, you've got Duke Cunningham getting over $70,000 a year. Dan Rostenkowski of the old post office scandal is pulling down way more than $130,000 a year. And of course, Ted Stevens. His offenses did not rise to the level of being deprived of a pension. He will collect over $120,000 a year.
Well, how the heck do we change this then, Pete?
Well, there are a couple of things. For the congressional criminals, we obviously have to expand the list of crimes. Some would say any federal felony ought to be grounds for prohibiting a lawmaker from getting a taxpayer-funded pension. Why should we be subsidizing these crooks? Now, overall, of course, we've got the presidential and congressional retirement systems, which are a drain on taxpayers, even if the criminals aren't the ones doing the draining. And there I think we need to consider several reforms. The presidential system, for example, could be put on a time limit, like lawmakers tried to do in the early 1990s, maybe give them 5 years or even 10 years of office benefits. But the pensions themselves really ought to be made into true pensions rather than simply payments. There ought to be a minimum retirement age. There ought to be perhaps a benefit based on how many terms they serve. And maybe we need to decouple this whole system from the salary of cabinet members, which is how this presidential pension is linked. Very bizarre. I think for Congress we need to figure out a way to get them into a formula that's based more on what rank and file federal employees get, rather than the super generous way of calculating the pension that they get now. We may even consider throwing the president and Congress into a system that many of us are dealing with in the private sector, and that's 401k plans. I think that would have a great benefit, because when the stock market went down, their investments would suffer too. They would have a built-in incentive to make better economic policy for all of us.
Speaking of economic policy, we're going to move on to our next segment with NTU Director of Government Affairs, Christina M. Rasmussen, our in-house expert on the economic stimulus plan currently before Congress.
So keep it right here on Gimme Radio for more news you can use here on Speaking of Taxpayers. And in our next segment of Speaking of Taxpayers, we have someone who speaks for taxpayers full-time. I'm talking about National Taxpayers Union's Director of Government Affairs, Christina M. Rasmussen. She's been prowling the halls of Congress trying to stop this stinky stimulus package. Welcome, Christina.
Thanks for having me on.
Take it away, Natasha.
Okay. NTU has had its hand on the pulse of taxpayer sentiment. What are taxpayers saying about this bill? How do they feel about the stimulus?
Taxpayers are furious, and they have every right to be. It is incredible to see the lard and pork that they've stuffed into this bill. And the more folks learn about it, the angrier they're getting when they hear about the spending provisions, like $400 million for STD prevention and what is supposed to be an economic stimulus package. They are angry.
Yeah, I've heard the polls are increasingly showing some public skepticism over this. It's as if they kind of look more in the trash can and they hate what they see and they smell.
You're absolutely correct. The level of support for this bill has been steadily decreasing. As more and more folks hear what's actually in this bill, they're understanding that its provisions are not pro-growth. For example, a recent poll found that only 38% of Americans support the bill as it currently stands, and 10% think that this plan will actually help grow the economy this year. So the skepticism is very high.
So it's like the deeper they look into the trash can, the less they like what they see and what they smell.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And a key role that NTU has been playing is highlighting these provisions. We're talking about what's actually in there. Ordinary citizens don't have the time to read 100-page bills. Folks at NTU, we do, and we're highlighting these provisions for them.
And just in case you're wondering, folks, that's Rasmussen Polling, no relationship to our great government affairs director here.
None whatsoever.
What are some of the most egregious examples of pork barrel spending in the stimulus? You mentioned a couple earlier, but what are some of the other ones you found?
The very egregious provisions in the House that were actually stripped included funding to re-sod the National Mall and funding for contraceptive and other family planning purposes. That was taken out, but I can tell you that much more remains. For example, there is money in the House bill to help the National Park Service celebrate its 100th birthday in 2016. There is money to help folks convert their TVs from analog to digital. There is money to buy bureaucrats new office furniture and new cars for the federal fleet. The list goes on and on.
Yeah, I've heard that there are a lot of underperforming programs and agencies getting money as well. That was what struck me going through the bill. You've got, for example, the Coast Guard in the Senate's bill getting money for icebreakers when its high-endurance cutter program, for example, has been just a boondoggle, way behind schedule, way over budget. Same with NASA. They're getting money for more climate research, and yet their key centerpiece, the Glory mission, which is supposed to look at the sun's effect on Earth's climate, that's way over budget, again, behind schedule. It's almost as if we're rewarding these agencies for their failures.
I can give you another great example, and that's Amtrak, scheduled to get $850 million from this stimulus bill. But the government's own performance review agency has rated Amtrak ineffective. Why on earth are we giving more money to an ineffective program with records of performance problems, misuse, and mismanagement?
Yeah, truly bizarre.
What efforts has NTU led against the stimulus to both inform taxpayers of what's in it and help engage them so they can contact their members of Congress to voice their concerns?
One of the first things that we did was join with other conservative taxpayer groups, folks who care about where taxpayer dollars are going, to create a website called readthestimulus.org. Basically a user-friendly, searchable version of the legislative text that people could search, read, and comment on the bill provisions. That has been very useful in digging up all these nasty little provisions that we've been talking about. We also went to our 362,000 members, and we've started calling campaigns, and it's fabulous. I tried calling my senators again yesterday, and I could not get through to their offices because it has been so busy. Folks are angry and they're calling. So really, in conjunction with news reports, media reports, and activating our membership, the pushback has been astounding.
Well, by the time this show airs, we may very well have had action in both chambers on the stimulus. They will almost certainly be going to a House-Senate conference committee to iron out the differences they have between the chambers, which are considerable and getting more so by the day. Do you think there's a possibility that even more wasteful spending will be added in that so-called conference process?
It is an absolute possibility. We've seen this happen time and time before. The House and the Senate will conference and the bills will get bigger and they'll get badder. That's a very real possibility. the saving grace could be that many moderate Republicans and Democrats are starting to back away from this bill because people are so angry. So my hope is that we can convince enough moderates to want to keep their hands free of this dirty mess, and that's where the chance for success will lie. Considering that the Congressional Budget Office has said that most of these funds won't hit the ground in 2009 anyway, we're arguing that the better route is slow down, take it easy, and get it right.
Yeah, the interesting thing is we often see earmarking, in other words, setting aside certain amounts of money for given projects to specified entities that members of Congress want, but we're not necessarily seeing that level of specificity yet in the bills. I think that once this thing progresses, once we start getting wind of where the money is going to states and localities, because these are all being given out primarily in block grants, people are going to be even more upset. Are we going to have plans in place to kind of monitor this money and perhaps give citizens the opportunity to voice complaints even after all of this dust is settled?
National Taxpayers Union has been monitoring the requests for this spending money as they come in. You can be absolutely assured that we will be monitoring the money as it goes out the door as well. You're right, the Senate has decided that instead of earmarking a bunch of projects, for the most part they're just creating these general funds that money will then be pulled out of for specific projects. However, we know, based on the requests made, for example, by the U.S. Conference of Mayors, that a lot of this money is going to be used on stupid projects, and they are silly. I mean, some of the projects we saw for the U.S. Conference of Mayors included golf courses, sewers for zoos, landscaping, sidewalks, the list goes on. And I think that members who vote for this package will end up being embarrassed by what comes out of it.
Yeah, sure, I imagine so. We had a little protest outside the Conference of Mayors meeting here in D.C. a couple of weeks ago, and we had a little film go up on the YouTube network if people want to see that. Again, that's YouTube, youtube.com, and if you type in National Taxpayers Union, you'll almost certainly see our video. A very interesting protest. You were there, I remember.
We had a great time. Basically, the U.S. Conference of Mayors came to D.C. for their annual meeting, and they were using this meeting as an opportunity to lobby for more taxpayer dollars and highlight their ready-to-go projects, the ones I was talking about, the golf courses and the sidewalks. We went outside their hotel where they were staying with signs detailing some of their more ridiculous requests, and we had our NTU taxpayer watchdog mascot come out, and it was fabulous to see him. We also got some mayors on camera asking them about their questionable spending, and you know, the mayor of Seattle even noted that some of the spending was very questionable.
Hear that, Seattle residents? Anyone who's listening out there, ask your mayor why he thinks the projects are questionable.
This package is being sold as a way to stimulate the economy, but what percentage of the House's $819 billion package or the Senate's $900 billion package would actually create jobs or improve infrastructure?
You know, very little. This bill was being sold as an infrastructure bill to taxpayers. That's why initially a lot of people got behind it. They thought that this money would go towards getting them out of traffic, for example, improving our highways and getting people home to their families faster at night. But when we actually saw the numbers, less than 3% of the funds were going to be spent on highways across the nation. 3% does not an infrastructure bill make.
What are some pro-taxpayer alternatives to stimulate the economy that are out there that NTU supports?
NTU decided to support a fabulous plan by the Republican Study Committee in the House. This is a group of Republican conservatives who decided that, you know, let's do away with this silly spending and let's actually give people long-lasting incentives to grow their business. Some of the provisions in this bill included cutting the corporate income tax rate. It included getting every single income tax bracket a 5% rate cut, and they were permanent changes for the most part. That's exciting news. A small business out there isn't going to say, wow, the U.S. Department of Commerce is getting $34 million to redo my headquarters. I'm going to grow my business. That's not how small businesses work. They're going to say, wow, the government's letting me keep more of my own money. This gives me enough money to bring on another employee to grow my business. That's what I'll do.
Yeah, now if I recall, isn't the U.S. corporate tax rate like one of the worst in the world?
You know, it is. We have a higher corporate tax rate than the European average, than France even. And it's a disservice because it encourages businesses to go abroad. We really could make a big difference by making America more competitive by cutting corporate income tax rates.
Yeah, that's something we ought to be able to compete with France if we don't want to make freedom fries anymore instead of French fries.
You got it.
You know, we've been seeing a lot in the press about everyone agrees that government has to do something to stimulate the economy, or that everyone knows spending more money from the government side will somehow increase jobs and economic growth, and yet the evidence doesn't really show that. It's very conflicting. I remember the Congressional Budget Office studied this question. They reviewed 15 separate pieces of research. They found 8 pieces of the research said, well, there's either very little effect or a slightly positive one. 7 of them said very little effect or a slightly negative one. That's a heck of an imbalance, really, to be hanging so many billions of dollars on. It's taking a heck of a chance.
We've heard Vice President Biden come out and say that there really is no opposition to this spending bill as an economic stimulus, and it's just false. The Cato Institute has done a fabulous job in collecting signatures from over 200 credentialed economists at universities across the country who said that they doubted spending as an economic stimulus. So folks who are trying to say that there's no opposition, they're just not telling the truth, because there is a lot of opposition to this as an economic stimulus.
Not only from academics, but from people at the grassroots like us.
Absolutely. I've talked to members of the National Taxpayers Union who've called up with their concerns and their skepticism, and they're not the only ones.
Well, what would you tell listeners to Gimme Radio to do at this point?
Follow up on this stimulus package is going to be so important. Come to the National Taxpayers Union website, ntu.org. We will provide key links to ways to keep this money accountable, keep it transparent, and make sure that it goes where it should.
Fantastic. If they can't be careful, well, we're going to make sure they aren't stupid.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thanks for joining us, Christina.
We're coming up on the final minutes of this inaugural edition of Speaking of Taxpayers. I'm Pete Sepp.
And I'm Natasha Altamirano. We wanted to let you know about an important event coming up this summer, the biennial National Taxpayers Conference, brought to you by the National Taxpayers Union and Foundation. This year's event will be held at the Hyatt Regency in Crystal City, just outside of Washington, D.C., and it'll feature speakers, networking, and panels on a variety of issues, including media training, new media techniques, how to lobby, how to raise money. And we've just secured one of our speakers, former Comptroller General David Walker, the former head of the GAO.
A very important figure in fighting waste, fraud, and abuse in government. We're very lucky to have him. We've been holding these meetings for the past 20 years, and unlike other conferences you may go to where there are just people talking at you, you will have the opportunity to talk with people to form your own community-level taxpayer group and start a tax revolt in your own backyard. That's what makes this event so unique, so useful. Virtually every major development in state and local taxpayer rights has had its genesis here at the National Taxpayers Conference. Alumni from everywhere, Colorado, Oregon, Washington State, Massachusetts, they've all made progress in their states, and we have been able to help them do that through these conferences.
Yes, taxpayer activists will gather from all around the country and will be able to share best practice techniques on some of their own successes. Registration for the conference is available online at NTU's website, www.ntu.org. That's ntu.org. There you'll be able to register, get hotel information, and keep up to date with the latest conference developments.
And don't forget, we have a special offer for Gimme Radio listeners, a special early bird rate on National Taxpayers Conference. Just $99 gets you all the conference materials, all the sessions, 2 lunches, 2 receptions. You won't find a better bargain anywhere else. Remember, sign up now. You get the early bird rate of $99 plus a great rate on the Hyatt Crystal City Hotel. Now this offer won't last for long, so I encourage listeners, if they're interested at all in starting a taxpayer group in their community, they should jump on this opportunity and sign up under the early bird rate. That's ntu.org. Well, that about wraps it up for this edition of Speaking of Taxpayers. We hope you had as much fun listening as we did presenting it to you. Remember, National Taxpayers Union is a nonpartisan, nonprofit citizen group with 362,000 members nationwide. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary, and we hope you'll celebrate with us by joining National Taxpayers Union. Again, that's ntu.org. And now, signing off, I'm Pete Sepp.
And Natasha Altamirano.
Remember, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. So listen to Speaking of Taxpayers on Gimme Radio. Until next week, so long.